All right, well, good evening, everyone, or afternoon, and welcome back to week 5 of PPA 500. Hope everyone's doing well and you're having a good week. First off, thank you for your draft advancement forms. I've reviewed all of those and then provided feedback. I think overall, all the course sequencing looked pretty good. Just remember that with 697, you have to have all your core courses done before you will be issued a permit to register in 697. So you can't have 697 in the same semester that you're taking another core course. They all have to be done before you get to 697. You can take an elective course in the same semester as 697, so that's not a problem. It just can't be another core course. I know that there are a few of the advancement forms I provided feedback asking for the semesters that you plan on taking the courses. So if you didn't submit a form that lists the semesters where you plan on taking the courses, please resubmit the form so that I can kind of see your course sequencing, so I can see if the sequencing makes sense. And some courses are offered in some terms and not offered in other terms. And there's kind of a, even though I'm not chair anymore, I know that there's kind of a pattern in how the courses are offered. So I can give you some feedback in terms of whether or not a specific course is likely to be offered in a certain semester or not. So that's the draft advancement form. So thank you for that. Coming up next week, you have a couple of assignments due next Tuesday by midnight, so the 27th by midnight. The first assignment is your third beach board essay. And for that one, you'll take the information we talked about last week of differences between public and private organizations. And then based upon the Graham Allison article that we discussed, you will be highlighting 2 similarities and 2 differences between public and private organizations. So that's what you'll be doing for your third beach board essay due next Tuesday. And then you also have your midterm assessment. So the midterm assessment I made available about a week ago, and so it's been up there and you can work on it at your leisure. We've covered a lot of the information that you'll need in order to complete that assessment, but I thought what would be good is to start out tonight, just walking through the assessment with you. If you've already been working on it, you're familiar with these scenarios. If not, then at least we'll kind of be on the same level playing field in terms of what the scenarios are and what my expectations are for you on this midterm assessment. Now, in doing the midterm assessment, again, you're able to use any information at your disposal. So you can use course information, you can use our lecture notes, PowerPoint slides. Any of that information is all fair game for you to use in completing the assessment. The assessment is not really designed to test your memory or anything like that. It's really truly an assessment of your ability to take the information you've learned in the class and apply that information appropriately in these different scenarios. So let me just walk you through some of the scenarios and what you'll be working on. So as you can see, there are 5 scenarios on the assessment. Each scenario is accompanied by 2 questions related to the scenario. After reading the scenario, utilize the information from the course, class sessions, textbooks, etc., to answer the questions. There are no right or wrong answers, and your responses will be evaluated based upon your justification of your answer. Remember, in public administration, we're usually not looking for the best answers, but rather the most appropriate answer for that situation. So again, there's no right answer for any of these. It's just a matter of, can you justify the answer that you are providing as an appropriate answer for that scenario? So each of these questions, the whole thing, the way I'll grade is 100 points. And so each scenario is 20 points. And then each question obviously is going to then be worth 10 points. Your assessment is due in the Dropbox no later than 11:59 and 59 seconds p.m. on September 27th. So your first scenario here is kind of your general American government foundations type of scenario. So our work as public administrators is predicated on the protections and limitations contained within the current manifestation of our Constitution. And we spent an entire half of a class going through the Constitution, and we went through all 7 articles and all 27 amendments. Assume you are a delegate at the Constitutional Convention, and you are part of James Madison's faction advocating for replacing the Articles of Confederation with a new Constitution. Remember, at the Constitutional Convention, The original design of the Constitutional Convention was merely to amend the Articles of Confederation, to try and fix some of the problems with the articles. We ended up actually throwing out those articles and completely replacing them with a new Constitution. So in 1A, present an argument for abolishing the Articles of Confederation by discussing three primary weaknesses in the articles. So the documents, the articles. I provide the Articles of Confederation, a copy of it on our Beachboard site. So hopefully you had a chance to look through that. We discussed some of the weaknesses in class. So I discussed three of those primary weaknesses. Be sure to not only identify these weaknesses, but also present a compelling argument for why these weaknesses may be considered fatal flaws in the Articles of Confederation. Then in 1B, present an argument designed to convince your fellow delegates. Many of them are considered anti-federalists, so they're on the other side of the spectrum from you, because you're basically a federalist, you're in Madison's position. Why they should trust this new Constitution that you and your fellow Federalists are proposing. In presenting your argument, include a discussion of three positive aspects of the new Constitution that may appeal to your anti-Federalist colleagues. Feel free to use Federalist number 39 in crafting your answer. Provided you with a link to Federalist 39 up on our Beachboard site. We also discussed Federalist 39 in class. That's where Madison deconstructs the Constitution to answer the question, is it federal in nature or is it national in nature? And so use that as your guide in answering 1B. Again, in answering each one of these questions, usually it's not going to take you a lot of words to answer them, I guess I should say. You can usually handle answering each one of these in a paragraph or two, and that's usually sufficient for each one of the questions. So that's scenario number one. Scenario number two. You've just started a new job with Kelman and Associates, a large advocacy firm ensconced within a historical brownstone on K Street in Washington, D.C. If you know anything about D.C., all the major lobbying firms have really nice offices on this street known as K Street. So all your top lobbyist firms are located on K Street. Excited by the prospect of the new job, you leave on your first day to Capitol Hill to meet with members of the Democratic caucus to discuss a proposed piece of legislation designed to designate several hundred acres of Wyoming open space as federally protected territory. You're shocked to learn that you are only one of many lobbyists scheduled to meet with legislators on this same topic today. In addition to you, there are drilling advocates from other advocacy firms, advocates representing the rights of indigenous people, and many others vying for the attention of the members of Congress. So in 2A, reflect on your predicament. What does Madison tell us about multiple factions in Federalist 10? Do you think Madison envisioned what you are experiencing? Why or why not? And we spent time going through Federalist 10 and talking about factions and controlling the effects of factions. So use that as your guide in answering 2A. 2B, in the course of your day, you meet with Representative Roger McGreevy, a 10-term representative from Idaho. As you begin to make your pitch for designating the land in question as federally protected open space, Representative McGreevy interrupts you. I have a keen interest in this bill because I own several acres in Wyoming adjacent to the land in question. I am opposed to the legislation. Drilling means jobs and commerce to the area, and my land value will skyrocket if I vote against this bill and allow drilling to commence. After a long day of meetings, you head to your K Street office, but can't stop thinking about what Representative McGreevy said. In your opinion, is what McGreevy told you an ethical violation? Should he recuse himself from discussions on the bill and any eventual vote? Why or why not? Would his behavior violate any of the standards in the ASPA Code of Conduct? So this is your accountability and your ethics question. Scenario number 3. The city of Preble Heights, which is a fictional city, is a working class neighborhood just outside of Indianapolis, Indiana. The city council has recently embarked upon a debate regarding the rehabilitation of the deteriorating recreation center on the outskirts of town. The recreation center has been closed for 6 months pending some major renovations to ensure safety of patrons. The council is split. 2 members would like to have the city spearhead the renovations. 2 members would like to turn the renovation project over to a private sector contractor who has a reputation for getting projects done quickly. The city manager presents a study that shows turning over the renovation to a private contractor would mean that the recreation center would be renovated 3 months ahead of schedule and would cost 20% less than if the project was managed by the city. The fifth council member is undecided and needs some guidance. So in 3A, discuss some of the reasons why the private sector may be able to complete the project and for less money than the city. In 3B, discuss some of the disadvantages of turning the project completely over to a private entity. So this gets you at your differences between public and private sectors in scenario number 3. Scenario number 4, as discussed in class, there is still some controversy regarding public administration as a discipline, and we are going to talk a lot about that here tonight. Some feel that public administration is a discipline. Others argue that it lacks the requirements of an academic discipline and is actually a subfield of political science. The debate can be seen in a location of MPA programs across the country. Many MPA programs exist within political science departments. Some are housed in a college of business, while others maintain status as a standalone department or college. That's what we are here at Long Beach. We're a standalone department. Discuss the field of public administration as a discipline. Which elements of the study of public administration make it a discipline? What elements argue against public administration as a discipline? Then in 4B, whether a discipline or not, the field of public administration has always struggled with the perception and reality of a politics administration dichotomy. Originally presented by Woodrow Wilson in 1887, the politics administration dichotomy debate has been a central theme in the field of public administration for many decades. Discuss the politics administration dichotomy and its impact on how we study and engage in public administration. Again, that's something we will talk about tonight. So as we're done talking about the midterm, that'll be our first topic for discussion this evening. So after tonight's session, you'll have the information, obviously, to answer that question. And then scenario 5, the Department of Aging in a state of confusion is in crisis. The governor appointed Perry Lemon as the director of the department 6 months ago. Lemon is an ardent partisan with no experience in issues of aging and no discernible leadership or management skills. Lemon's incompetence has only added to a toxic organization culture where there's little trust between employees and outright warfare between units over scarce resources. It's not uncommon for one unit to sabotage another unit, and there's little indication that units know or care about the mission of the organization. This toxic culture has resulted in several externalities. Retention is at an all-time low. Employees are leaving the organization so quickly that HR cannot replace them with new employees. The onboarding process consists of a 10-minute video explaining the organization's purpose and little else. The organization has become fixated on applying rules and regulations with little regard for serving citizens. It's gotten so bad that the state legislature has lost confidence in the department, which has led to a further reduction in the organization's appropriations. 5A, select 2 classical organization theories or theorists that you feel would benefit the organization. Discuss these theories and why they would benefit the organization. 5B, select 2 neoclassical organization theories. And by neoclassical, we'll talk about this in the second half of class tonight, but neoclassical organization theories in public administration are things like human relations, human resource management, systems theory, and a lot of those theories we'll talk about in the second half tonight. But select 2 of those neoclassical organization theorists or theories that you feel would benefit the organization and discuss these theories and why they would benefit that organization. So scenario 5 is essentially your organization theory scenario. Again, you'll have all the information at the end of class tonight in order to answer that question in scenario number 5. So that's a midterm assessment. Again, parsimony is always important. So be as parsimonious and concise as you can be with your answers. Again, 1 to 2 paragraphs for each one of the questions certainly is sufficient. One way to make it very easy for you to do the assessment and easy for me to grade the assessment is just, put your answers directly into the exam and, download a copy of the exam and just put your answers directly in there. If you put in a different color, like your answers in red or your answers in blue, just kind of helps them stand out. And then it makes it easier for me to grade your assessment makes it a little bit easier for you to write your assessment. But again, 1 to 2 paragraphs for each question usually tends to be sufficient. You don't have to include citations. You don't have to do outside research. Essentially, you're just using what you've learned in the course to address the questions related to those 5 different scenarios. So that being said, are there any preliminary questions on the midterm assessment?
Just to clarify, you said 1 to 2 paragraphs per question. Do you mean the number or the actual letter? Like 1 paragraph for letter A, 1 paragraph for letter B, or 1 to 2 for each letter?
Yeah, usually 1 to 2 paragraphs for each letter. And so, so like you're saying, for 5A, select 2 classic organization theorists that would be useful. You have 1 brief paragraph for, maybe Max Weber and his theories we talked about tonight, and then another paragraph for Frederick Taylor. And then do the same thing then for 5B for neoclassical. So 1 to 2 paragraphs for each letter. Okay. Any other questions or any clarifications or anything on the midterm assessments? Okay, I'm sure as you are working on this, you'll probably have some questions, and feel free to reach out. See, Ryan asked if we feel the need to, is it all right to include citations of the articles we have read? Absolutely. Yeah, the articles from the classic text, you include information from there, you want to cite that. That's absolutely fine, obviously. Yeah, I'm kind of considering the classics articles as all kind of a fair game in that it's just something you read and something we discussed in the class. But yes, you can always include citations for those articles that you use. Okay, any other questions? Good? Okay, like I said, if you have any questions about it between now and when it's due next Tuesday, feel free to reach out and I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have. Let me stop that share and let me pull up our slides for the evening. And we're going to kind of pick up where we left off last week. So we'll pick up from our Woodrow Wilson slide. If you remember last week, what we discussed is we were talking a lot about public and private sector organizations and the differences between the public and private sectors. And one of the reasons why we were doing that is we were doing that to, again, provide justification for being in an MPA as opposed to an MBA program. There's a reason why we study public administration and public organizations differently than we study private organizations. You read the Graham Allison article. We discussed the Graham Allison article. And the basic thesis in the Graham Allison article, as we talked about last week, is that there is this thing called generic management theory that says that the functions and the activities done by private sector managers are similar to the functions and the activities that are done by public sector managers. So all managers have to hire employees, they have to staff their organizations, they all have to do strategic planning, they all have to acquire resources and manage budgets, they all have to evaluate employees, they all do these similar types of functions regardless of if it's IBM or if it's the Department of Agriculture. That's generic management theory. But Allison points out the big difference is not what they're doing, but how they are doing it. So how we manage our employees is different in the public sector because of career civil service. We have career civil servants we're working with who are oftentimes unionized. In the private sector, they're dealing with at-will employees, and at-will employees can be fired and disciplined much easier than you can fire or discipline a career civil servant. The money we have and we get in our public organizations come from appropriations. And so there are appropriations that are passed by legislative bodies. Those appropriations tend to be much more static and dependable than the flow of revenue in the private sector when the private revenue comes from sales, which fluctuate much more and are much more dynamic. So one of the arguments is that since we're getting our appropriations, our money from appropriations, and they're stable appropriations, there's sometimes in the public sector a little bit less incentive to be efficient because we assume we're going to get those same appropriations next year with probably a little bit of an increase year after year after year. The private sector, if you're not being efficient and you're not producing an effective product, your sales are going to go down. You're going to get eaten alive in terms of competition, and you're no longer going to have the revenue in order to survive. And so, it's kind of, we're all managing resources, but the resources are different between public and private sectors. The oversight is different between public and private sectors. We serve many masters in the public sector. So we serve the executive, the legislature, the judicial. You don't have those many masters to serve in the private sector. And we have a lot of scrutiny from the media and from interest groups in the public sector that you don't have in the private sector. So essentially, we're doing similar things, we're just doing them differently in the public sector. And that then provides us with a justification for the need to study public administration and public organization differently than we would have studied a private sector organization. So again, that kind of gives us this foundation for a separate field of study for public administration, separate from the world of business. Woodrow Wilson, who wrote the classic article, The Study of Administration, and this was written way back in 1887. And the Wilson article is oftentimes pointed to as the birth of the field of public administration. This is kind of the genesis of where the study of public administration came from. And we know that in recent years, the history has kind of shown us about Woodrow Wilson. He had some very unsavory opinions. We know that while he was president, there were a lot of racial undertones to some of the things that he did as president. And so his image today is not what it was 100 years ago. And we have to acknowledge that, certainly. But we also have to acknowledge that the article that he wrote, The Study of Administration, really did provide the foundation for the field of public administration and the basis, if you will, for why we need to study administration separately from our study of politics. So Woodrow Wilson, as you know, was president of the United States. Before he was president of the United States, he was president of Princeton University. He was an academic. He was a historian primarily, and he focused most of his attention on studying the U.S. Congress. He actually wrote a very famous book on the U.S. Congress and how Congress works without ever actually visiting Congress. So he kind of wrote this book without having a firsthand experience with Congress, but he was a very well-known academic before he became president. And in his academic life, before he became president, is when he wrote this article, The Study of Administration. So the argument that Wilson makes for us is that if we want to be more efficient at what he calls the business of government, we need to study administration somewhat separately from our traditional examination of politics. That if we can pull administration out of politics, we will be able to become more efficient at doing what he called the quote unquote business of government. And so that's what gives us this thing called the politics administration dichotomy. The politics administration dichotomy, as was understood by a lot of scholars after Wilson had written his article, was that there is a line of demarcation between politics and administration. And if we can pull the politics out of our study of administration, then what we can do, according to Wilson, is we can borrow administrative innovations from other countries that may have different political systems and different political cultures than we have here in the US. And the example that Wilson uses is he uses civil service. So he says, we have this system of civil service that came as a result of the Pendleton Act in 1883. And next week we'll get into, in the second half of class, talking about the Pendleton Act and what that did in terms of introducing merit-based hiring. But so we have the system of civil service where people got their jobs not based upon their party affiliation, but rather they got their jobs in government based upon their qualifications. They were hired based upon their merit. Did they have the knowledge, skills, and abilities to do the job? Well, that wasn't a new thing that we created here in the US. That's something that England had been using for years. England had its own system of civil service, of merit-based hiring. And the argument Wilson makes is that if we can take those innovations, and we're studying administration separate from politics, we can take those innovations from England and we can borrow them and bring them into the United States and make that our system of administration. We can borrow that careers civil service system from England and apply it to America. However, and so that's kind of this idea of the politics administration dichotomy. If we can separate politics and administration, then we can better study administration to make administration more efficient. However, there is one line as you read Wilson's article that is very important. And that's the line that says that politics is the touchstone of administration. What he means by politics is the touchstone of administration is that, yes, we can borrow these administrative innovations from England, but when we bring them to America, we have to modify them to make them fit our unique political culture. So one example of that is one of the innovations we borrowed in civil service from England is we borrowed examinations. So in England, to get a job in the British civil service, you had to sit for an examination. If you performed well enough on that examination, you scored well enough on the test, you would then be hired into the British civil service. Well, a test, at least back then, was a good way of testing for someone's merit, their knowledge, skills, and abilities. So we started using testing for hiring into the American system of public administration as well. The difference was that in the British system of civil service, they had a system of closed examinations, in that not everyone was eligible to take these exams to get jobs in the British civil service. We knew in America, our political culture was a more open type of political culture. So we took those closed examinations and we transformed them into open examinations to use here in America to match our more open political culture. Another example is how people enter into the career civil service. In England, there was no lateral entry into the career civil service, meaning that if you were in a high-level management position in a private corporation and you wanted to move over into the public sector at that same high-level management position, you were unable to do that in England. You would have to go back to the bottom of the classification chart and work your way back up if you want to go from private to public sector. Well, again, in our political culture, it's a more open political culture. And so we made our career system of civil service one of lateral entry so that you could go from an upper management position in a private organization laterally into the same type of management position in a public organization because, again, of our different, more open political culture. So that's just an example of what he means by politics as the touchstone of administration. Yes, by studying administration, we can borrow innovations from around the world to make our administration more efficient, to be more efficient at doing the business of government. But we always have to remember that whatever innovations we're borrowing, we have to modify them to make them fit our unique political culture. That's why a clear distinction between politics and administration today is really rejected by most students of public administration, because we realize there is not that clear line between politics and administration. We realize that sometimes administration bleeds over into politics and politics will bleed back over into administration. As we talked about last week, public managers are involved not just in policy execution, but also policy formation. They're not only involved in carrying out policies, they're also involved in creating and formulating those policies to begin with. And that's a big difference between the public and the private sector. Like we said last week, private sector organizations are mostly engaged in the execution or implementation of policy. Public sector organizations do both execution as well as formulation. So whenever you have administrators who are contributing to the policy formulation process, they are inherently carrying out some political types of activities. So the line is not as clear as elected officials, the politicians make the policies, and the administrators carry out those policies. We know we don't have that type of a politics administration dichotomy. We realize that there is a blurring of the lines between politics and administration. But that being said, even though we have that blurring of the lines, we have administrators who do both administration as well as politics, we know that the motivations of elected officials and public administrations tend to be much different from each other. The motivation of elected official, obviously, is to get reelected. They want to get reelected and move up to higher elective office. So their behaviors will all be oriented around this reelection motivation. Administrators are career civil servants, so they don't have that same aspiration of getting elected to higher office. So they're there hopefully to make good policy and to implement policy well. So even though you have a blurring of the lines between politics and administration, you still have different motivations on the part of elected officials versus administrators. But you'll oftentimes hear people talk about the politics administration dichotomy, but it's important for us to realize that that dichotomy is not as clear as it was originally presented back in the 1880s, that we really do have very much of a blurring of the lines between politics and administration. But the idea behind the Wilson article is Wilson is arguing for this independent study of administration. And by arguing for this independent study of administration, it kind of lays the groundwork for programs like this and for and public administration being, if not a standalone academic discipline, at least a field of study. So we can make some generalizations about how we study public administration. And so three basic generalizations about the study of public administration. Number one, public administration is timeless, yet it is also time bound. So what does that mean? Public administration is timeless, meaning that there are some theories of public administration that were just as true today as perhaps they were in the 1940s and 1950s. As we'll see in the second half of class tonight, in the 1940s and 50s, a school of thought grew up known as the Human Relations School. And the Human Relations School argued that we needed to pay more attention to our individual employees. We can't just completely deny that those individual employees have merit and have self-worth. We have to consider those employees in order to make our organizations effective and efficient. Well, that's just as true today as it was then. And we know today, that's why we have HR departments. That's why we have training programs and professional development programs. We know that we cannot deny the importance of individual employees. So that's kind of a timeless maxim that applies today as well as it did back in the 1940s and the 1950s. But we also know public administration is also time bound, meaning that the way in which we run our organizations in the public sector will be an artifact of the time in which we are functioning. So how we run our organizations, or how we ran our organizations in the 1940s, the early 1940s, will certainly be a lot different than how we run organizations today. In the 1940s, we're at the heyday of World War II. And so there's a lot of rationing, and there are a lot of limited resources that organizations had to deal with, much more so than if you're running an organization today. So there are some timeless principles, but public administration is still impacted by the context of the time period in which we are doing that administration. A second generalization about the study of public administration is universal, but it is also culture bound and will vary according to the situation. It is universal in that we have human beings managing human beings interacting with human beings. And so some of those psychological and sociological principles of human interaction are universal, regardless of where they're happening, within an organization or which organization they're happening in. You've got those universal types of relationships. But we also know that each organization is going to have its own culture. And again, the second half of class tonight, we will talk about a school of thought called organization culture. And every organization has its own unique culture. So in order to understand how administration is happening within an organization, we must first understand the unique culture of that organization, the unique values and expectations and norms in this organization versus another organization. So it's universal, but it's also culture bound. And then the third generalization is public administration is complex, but it's only intelligible, it's only understandable through modeling. So in order to understand a complex situation, we will create theories and models. And those theories and models will then help us understand the complex situation of public administration. That is important because once you start developing unique models and theories, you start to go down the road toward being an academic discipline. Because one of the major characteristics of a discipline is that they have their own unique models and theories about how the world works. So once you need these theories, you then start to work toward being an academic discipline. So public administration is complex. Anything that is complex means we have to have some type of a science of studying it. If it was simple, we probably wouldn't need to be an academic discipline. We wouldn't need to generate all these theories and all these models. We know that public administration is complex because organizational systems are complex as well. And one single model is not going to be enough to explain the complex situation in public organizations. So the question then becomes, why are public organizations complex? Where does that complexity come from? Well, that complexity comes from a variety of different sources. There are a lot of complicating factors in the world of public administration that makes public administration and the study of administration complex in nature. Things such as the interconnections between policy making and policy execution. As we said, we really have a blurring of the lines between politics and administration. We have administrators who are participating in the formulation of policy by advising elected officials, kind of being the experts to provide the information elected officials need to construct their policies. But then we also have politicians who are involved in the execution and implementation of policy. They will conduct oversight over administrators and agencies in terms of how effectively and efficiently these policies are being executed and implemented. So there's a lot of that interconnection that then adds a lot of complexity to understanding public administration. There's a big need for coordination in public administration as well. We have a lot of different agencies and a lot of different actors that are involved in any one single program or any one single policy. A lot of the work of government is done through what's called indirect administration. In indirect administration, you're going to have, for instance, the federal government that provides the resources through grant money to make a program possible, but then the actual implementation of that program is being done by maybe a local government agency in partnership with perhaps a local nonprofit, sometimes in partnership with the business community as well. That requires a lot of coordination with all these different moving parts, which enhances complexity. Relationships and power. When you have all these relationships going on between different individuals and different organizations, you can have power asymmetry. You can have different individuals and organizations having differential amounts of power and resources. So you need to know the resources that one actor brings to the table versus the resources that another actor brings to the table. And so there's a lot of differential power. There's a lot of differences in the resources that all these different actors have, again, contributing to complexity in public administration. Another source of complexity is this idea of administration floating in the seas of time, meaning that, again, how we administer our organizations will be dependent upon when we are doing it, the period of time that we are doing it. And so we're very much subject to the environment around us and changes in the environment around us. Some organizations are very top-down, some organizations are very bottom-up. Top-down organizations obviously are very classical types of organizations where directives and orders come from above and are then handed down to lower level members of the organization. Bottom-up organizations really empower people at the lower end of the organization to participate in decision making. So there's no one-size-fits-all approach to what organizations look like and how organizations behave, again, making them much more complex in nature. Think about the example of a commission. So we've got independent regulatory commissions, or IRCs. Independent regulatory commissions have a very flat structure. in that they're headed up by 3 or 5 or 7 commissioners. So you can have a little bit more of a bottom-up egalitarian type of relationship than if you had a classic Department of Agriculture, where you have a secretary, then you have deputy secretaries, and as you go down the organization structure, you then encounter more and more positions in kind of that pyramidal classic organization theory type of shape. They're going to act a lot differently than a more egalitarian commission form of government. Information also adds to the complexity, and this is one that's becoming more complex with each passing day. There's a plethora of information. We're kind of in a sea of information. And so it becomes important for administrators and those of us who study administration to be able to distinguish between credible and non-credible information. And more information we encounter today is not credible information, and we're just kind of inundated with a whole bunch of information that we have to try and make sense of. The structure of organizations, as we said before, will also be different and will add to that complexity. Some organizations are centralized in one location. Some organizations are very decentralized, and they have a headquarters, like a Department of Agriculture has a headquarters in Washington, D.C., but it will then have field and regional offices spread across the entire country. Each one of those field and regional offices could very well have its own unique organization culture. So you can't just say, here's the culture of the Department of Agriculture. You need to know the culture of the regional field office in Missoula, Montana, or wherever. And so that, again, adds a whole lot of complexity. And the values that underpin public administration also add complexity. We are not just all about efficiency. In the private sector, it's about the bottom line. It's about producing a profit. And so therefore, we're very much focused in the private sector on efficiency as a primary value. But in the public sector, we have a lot of other values that we have to be concerned about as well, in addition to efficiency. So things like effectiveness, the quality of the products and services that we are creating, and the impact that those products and services are having on our citizens, and the actual consequences of what we are doing on the everyday lives of our citizens. And that's kind of effectiveness. Political responsiveness. We still have to be politically responsive to the many masters and the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. Social equity is a very important value in public administration today as well. The protection of individual rights, representative bureaucracy. So we have multiple competing values in public administration that, again, will add to that complexity of studying administration. The reality is that administration is too complex to be explained by a singular abstract theory, that we need a set of theories, different types of theories, in order to truly understand all these different aspects of a very complex world of public administration. So what? Well, what does that mean? That then leads us directly into this discussion of public administration as an academic discipline. Since administration is complex and has become more complex with each passing year. You read the Woodrow Wilson article back in 1887, one of the justifications that Wilson gives for creating this separate study of administration is that administration was so complex in the late 1800s. Well, compare how complex it was in the late 1800s to how complex it is today. So if we had a need for a discipline of public administration in 1887, it's difficult to see that that need is any less so true today with all the complexity that we're dealing with in today's administration. So when you have a very complex study, topic that you need to study, that means you need to have some methodologies in how you study that topic. You need to have processes and practices you can put in place to develop your theories and to develop your models so you can test those theories and test those models very much as we do in all social science types of disciplines. So for years in public administration, we have known that public administration is worthy of study. The question that we have always struggled with is, should it be a separate academic discipline, or can we study administration adequately enough as a subfield of an existing academic discipline? So my degree, I got my degree back east, and in my program, my PhD program is very much of a classical political science program. As a classical political science program, we had several different subfields. So you get your PhD in political science, but then you specialize in maybe political theory, comparative politics, international relations, American government, the presidency and Congress, state and local government, public administration, and public policy. So we had all these as subfields within the world of political science. So when I got my PhD, I had my concentration areas were presidency, Congress, state and local government, and public policy and administration. And it was seen as being very much of a subfield within the world of political science. When I took my examinations, I had 1 day on presidency, 1 day on Congress, 1 day on state and local government, and 1 day on public administration and public policy. That's kind of this classical approach. The public administration is really a subfield within the broader academic disciplines such as political science. The other approach, obviously, is that it is too big and complex to be part of another academic discipline, and it's unique enough that it should be its own academic discipline. And there are a lot of programs that offer PhDs in public administration, or DPAs, which is the professional public administration degree, a doctorate in public administration. And so it's an actual academic discipline in and of itself. There are departments of public administration like we have here at Cal State Long Beach. I do a lot of work with our accrediting body and go around and help programs get reaccredited. And when I do my site visits, I see a whole broad manifestation of public administration programs. Some are in departments of public administration like we are here at Long Beach. A lot of them are programs offered within a department of political science as part of the academic discipline of political science. Sometimes public administration is combined together with healthcare administration. In a few, not a lot, but some schools, public administration is a subfield of the College of Business. And so there are a lot of different arrangements that you see across the country with public administration. Our question, though, as you enter an MPA program, is whether or not you think public administration is its own academic discipline, or is it merely a subfield in another academic discipline like political science. And that's important because if you believe that public administration generates its own theories, generates its own models, has its own unique processes and expectations and methodologies, then you would argue that public administration is a standalone discipline. However, if you think public administration does not have its own unique theories and merely borrows theories from other disciplines and doesn't have its own unique methodologies, then that would lend you toward arguing that it's merely a subfield in another academic discipline. The elements of an academic discipline are just what I said. Essentially, an academic discipline is an area of study that has its own unique methods and theories and models. And it needs to be unique from other academic disciplines. So if you think about an academic discipline such as psychology, psychology has different methodologies than sociology will have. And they approach their phenomena in much different ways. They have different methodological tools and methodological approaches. They, in psychology, are very much more focused on human behavior and how people think and how that relates to how people behave. In sociology, you're looking more at relationships between individuals as opposed to individual thought processes. So different ways in which we are looking at similar type of phenomena. So I'm not going to give you the answer here tonight about whether or not public administration is an academic discipline or a subfield of another discipline. I'm going to leave that to you to decide, and I'm going to leave it to you to decide whether or not public administration demonstrates the uniqueness that is necessary to be considered an academic discipline. But the so what question here is, again, if you believe it's its own academic discipline, then that's justification for it being separate from other disciplines because it is unique enough to be separate. If you don't think that's that unique, then you would assume that it is part of another academic discipline, which then borrows methodologies from its parent discipline. I'm going to leave it to you because, as you saw in the midterm assessment, you're going to be answering a question on the midterm where you tell me whether or not you think public administration is an academic discipline and why you think it is or why you think it is not. And you're also going to be doing this later on in Beach Board for one of your Beach Board essays as well. So I'm going to leave the discussion here and let you form your own opinion about whether or not public administration is an academic discipline. But it's an important thing to think about because you are in a Master's of Public Administration program. And so you have ventured into a program that is oriented all around public administration and studying things differently than if you have chosen to go into a Master's of Business Administration. And so this is an important thing to think about, whether or not you believe that we are our own academic discipline or a subfield within another discipline. But regardless of whether we are our own academic discipline or we are a subfield in another academic discipline, public administration over the years has developed its own approaches in terms of its own schools of thought and its own theories. And so one of the major things we do here as an introduction into the MPA program is to introduce you to some of the major schools of thought and theories within the field of public administration. And what I like to do is I like to not only introduce you to these theories and these schools of thought, but to kind of show you the evolution and the development of theoretical approaches in public administration. Because there are some threads that tie all these different theories and these approaches together. So we're going to spend some time now talking about these theoretical perspectives, but we're going to do it in a chronological nature. So we're going to start with some of the first theories in public administration, or what we call the classical school, going all the way back to the late 1800s. Then we'll move into some neoclassical theories, and we'll talk about things like human relations theory, human resource management theory, systems theory, and some more modern theories to bring it into the contemporary period of time and show you how these different schools of thought and how these different theoretical perspectives have shifted over the past 150 years. Because again, as either an academic discipline or a field of study, we have our own theories that we apply to understand the phenomena that occur within the public sector and occur within public organizations. Any questions up to this point in time on public administration, the study of public administration as an academic discipline? Any questions up to this point? Okay, if not, then I would propose, I know it's kind of early in the evening, but I would propose we go ahead and take a break now because I kind of want to avoid interrupting our momentum as we're going through all these different schools of thought and the development of these theoretical perspectives. So let's go ahead and take a break now. Let's come back at, we'll come back at 5:10. And when we come back at 5:10, we'll jump into these different schools of thought and I'll take you through the whole evolution and development of these theoretical perspectives on public administration. So come back at 5:10 and we'll get into public administration theories. Okay, welcome back. It's 5:10, so we'll get back into it. And what I want to do for the remainder of the class tonight is to focus on these theories. Let me make sure we're recording. Yeah, focus on these theories of public organizations. Because again, when you're studying public administration, obviously the work of public administration all occurs within these public organizations. So a lot of what we're going to talk about the rest of tonight are these theories on public organizations, how we study public organizations, how we make those public organizations effective. Now, the schools of thought and the theories we talked about tonight, this is the first time you're seeing them in the program, but it's certainly not the last time you're going to see them. So you're going to talk about these same theories and theorists once you get to PPA 660 organization theory. But our purpose tonight is just kind of hit the tip of the iceberg in terms of giving you some exposure here in your first class in the program of some of these schools of thought and these theories that have really kind of dominated public administration over the past several years. So we're going to go all the way back to the late 1800s. So again, Woodrow Wilson wrote his Study of Administration in 1887, postulating that it would be beneficial to have a separate study of administration. So whenever we create this separate study of administration, it means that as we study administration, we are going to develop theories for how to study those administrative organizations. So the first school of thought that grew up on public organization theory was what's called the classical school. Now, the classical school of organization theory is all predicated upon trying to make organizations effective. And the kind of thread that ties all of these classical theorists together is the search for a one-size-fits-all approach. We oftentimes call it a panacea, a cure-all. So is there a panacea, a one-size-fits-all approach that can be applied to all organizations in order to make these organizations as efficient and effective as possible? So the ultimate goal is to make the organization efficient and effective. So in this classical school, where we usually start the discussion of classical organization theory is with Max Weber. And Max Weber was a German sociologist writing in the late 1800s. Max Weber believed that the most appropriate way, or the best way for him, the best way to achieve efficiency and effectiveness is through structure. So Weber studied how can we structure our organizations to make them effective and efficient. So his focus was on organizational structure. Weber believed in bureaucratic organizations. He believed that a bureaucracy was the highest form of rationalism, rationality. He believed that that is kind of the apex of rationality. That's what we're trying to achieve. He felt that a bureaucratic organization would achieve rationality because it would base its decision-making on empirical evidence. So he was an empiricist. Rather than just believing things, he believed that organizations should develop information, develop empirical, tangible evidence to use in their decision-making. So the way in which you do that is through his theory of the ideal bureaucracy. So Weber argued there is an ideal way of structuring a bureaucratic organization. And his ideal bureaucracy consists of the elements that you see on the screen. Number one, an ideal bureaucracy had a tall hierarchy. It's that pyramidal shape to your organization structure, where at the top of the organization, you have one singular director, one singular leader. But as you move down your organization structure, you encounter more and more and more positions. So it's that pyramid, that tall hierarchy. In that tall hierarchy, organizations then divide up the work. They engage in division of labor. So everyone has their own job, and their job will be different than someone else's job. So we divide up the labor, we divide up the work. When you divide up the work, you then have individual employees who are specializing in certain tasks day in and day out. So we divide up the work, we give this person this portion of work, and they will then specialize in certain types of jobs every single day. And they'll do specialized tasks every single day, and their tasks that they're doing will be different than the tasks that someone else is doing. That's called specialization of tasks. The nice thing about specialization of tasks, according to Weber, is that when these people specialize in the same jobs day in and day out, they become experts at what they are doing. They know that job better than anyone else in the world. So you have an organization that then will be staffed by experts. In this ideal bureaucratic structure, you also have what he refers to as unity of command, meaning that everyone knows to whom they are responsible. So people at the lower level, they have superiors, and those people have superiors, and those people have superiors, all the way until you narrow it to the very top of the organization, and that person who is ultimately in charge of the entire organization. It's a unity of command. Everyone knows to whom they are accountable. In that unity of command, he also advocates for what he calls a span of control. So managers only are responsible for a limited number of employees. They only have direct responsibility for a limited number of employees. So a manager may be responsible for 5 employees underneath them. And then those employees are then responsible for a limited number of people below them, and so on and so on. Again, in very much that pyramidal type of shape to your organization structure. These bureaucrats, these people working in this ideal bureaucracy, are professional career employees. Weber assumed that people working in this ideal bureaucracy would be professionals. They would have the skills and the abilities to do the tasks that they are specializing in, to do the work that's being assigned to them. Not only are they professionals with the skills to do the jobs, but they are also career employees. They view their presence in that organization as a lifetime career. He doesn't assume that they're going to bounce from one organization to another. They are committed to this organization for their entire career. And what people do and how they do it within the organization will be dictated by written rules and regulations. The rules, the processes, and the regulations will all be formalized and will all be written. So we have our written policies and procedures manuals. The advantage of having written documentation for policies and procedures is that you can treat people equally, and that when you have new employees that come into the organization, they can pick up that policy manual and know exactly what they're supposed to do and how they are supposed to do it. So you can see an ideal bureaucratic structure, according to Weber, was a very regimented, very strict, very detailed type of an organization. And Weber felt that by constructing and structuring our organizations in this ideal bureaucratic type of method, that's how we can make our organizations efficient and effective. And again, this was a panacea. This was a one-size-fits-all approach, that you could take this ideal bureaucratic structure and implement it in all different organizations and make all those different organizations efficient and effective. So Weber really believed that we could be effective through organization structure through this ideal bureaucracy. A second classical theorist in the classical school is Frederick Taylor. And Frederick Taylor is best known for his theory of scientific management. Whereas Weber focused on the structure of the organization, Taylor focuses on the work process. He focuses on the processes of doing work within the organization. Taylor had a very poor view of employees. And when you read Taylor's work, you'll see him refer to employees as being, quote unquote, boorish beasts. He refers to them as cogs in the machinery of the organization. So for Taylor, individual employees were literally cogs in the machinery. So the implication there is, if you have a machine and you full of all these cogs, and if a tooth breaks off of a cog, you throw that cog away and you replace it with a new cog. People were replaceable. They didn't necessarily have any of that inherent value because they were boorish beasts who had to be told how to do the job efficiently. So Taylor's approach was searching for the one best way to do a job in the organization. He felt that we could deconstruct jobs, analyze those jobs, figure out the most efficient way of doing those jobs, then teach our employees how to do those jobs in those efficient ways, then monitor and evaluate them to make sure that they are doing the jobs in this one best way. If they're not doing the job in the one best way, then you get rid of that person and you replace that person with someone else. If they are doing the job in the one best way, then you reward them with money and you give them pay for performance, which will then motivate them to continue doing the job in the one best way. In scientific management, the way Frederick Taylor would do it is through his series of time motion studies, where he would literally have a performance analyst stand there and time every single aspect of a job. And the simple example that Taylor always used was shoveling pig ore. So you would have someone standing behind that person shoveling pig ore. He would time how long it would take the person to put the shovel into the pile of ore, how long would it take the person to lift up the full shovel, how long would it take the person to take the shovel over to the cart, how long would it take them to dump the ore into the cart, how long would it take them to go back to the pile and then start the process again. With time, every single movement that that person took in that job would then get rid of what he called the false movements. So any movement that person was taking that was inefficient, he would identify and then eliminate those inefficient movements. And then all the efficient movements would all then be combined together into what he referred to as the one best way to do the job. Once we identified the one best way to do the job for all of these positions in our organization, we could then hire people who had the skills to do those jobs in the one best way, then train them in the one best way to do the job, monitor them, get rid of them if they're not doing it the one best way, reward them monetarily if they were doing the job in the one best way. And that's what would make our organizations efficient and effective. So whereas Weber focused on the structure of the organization, Taylor is focusing on the work process. But what unifies them together is they were both looking for the one best way in order to make organizations more efficient and more effective. Now, obviously, scientific management did not really pay much attention at all to the inherent self-worth of employees. Employees were just cogs in the machinery that could be replaced. But despite those problems with scientific management is still with us today in modern organizations. Vestiges of scientific management in a modern organization are things such as position classification systems. So in your organization, you probably have a classification, and that classification for your position will then dictate your amount of compensation. Ostensibly, positions that require more experience or require a higher skill set, those are going to be classified higher than other positions and then compensated accordingly. So the position classification system we're all so familiar with in the public sector is very much an artifact of scientific management. Position descriptions, and most of you in your positions will have a position description, which will describe what you are doing, the types of tasks you're doing, probably the percentage of time you are spending on each one of those tasks. That job description is also a vestige of Frederick Taylor and scientific management. So despite its flaws of that really not paying attention to individual employees and kind of dehumanizing individual employees, a lot of the things we do today in our modern organizations are still predicated upon a lot of those theories that come out of Frederick Taylor and scientific management. So that's another classical type of theory. A third classical theory, and then once you get to 660, you'll talk about a lot of other theorists, but a third classical theory is what's known as the principal school. And there are several authors within this principal school that you'll talk about in 660, like Henri Fayol and Mooney and a lot of them. But tonight in our class, we're just, again, getting the tip of the iceberg. So the one we'll focus on is Luther Gulick. And the reason why I like to focus on Luther Gulick in this class is because Gulick was one of these principles theorists that was able to have a practical impact on the federal bureaucracy. Luther Gulick was able to take his theories and actually apply them in the Reorganization Act in the 1930s of the federal bureaucracy. He served on the Brownlow Commission, and the Brownlow Commission was the commission that put together this reorganization plan to completely restructure and reorganize the federal bureaucracy, predicated on a lot of the theories of Luther Gulick and his principal school of thought. So Luther Gulick and the principal school. The principal school basically says that we can be efficient and effective as an organization if we can provide our managers and leaders with a managerial toolkit. And this managerial toolkit consists of several principles you see on the screen. The principal school is oftentimes referred to as the acronym of POSDCRB, P-O-S-D-C-R-B. Stands for planning, organizing, staffing, directing, coordinating, reporting, and budgeting. These are those generic management functions we've talked about several times this semester that are kind of shared by private as well as public organizations. We all have to engage in strategic planning. We all have to organize our institutions. We all have to staff, get people to work in our organizations. We have to direct those people in terms of what they're doing on a daily basis. We have to coordinate their work to help us achieve the goals of the organization. We have to have reporting mechanisms so we can report on how well we are achieving our goals and objectives. We have to manage our finances through the budgeting function. So these different principles, planning, organizing, staffing, directing, coordinating, reporting, and budgeting, are the generic principles that apply both in the private as well as the public sector. But Gulick said, if we can teach our managers how to do these different principles, and then they'll know which principle to use in which situation, essentially a toolkit, so they can reach in and pull out the appropriate tool at the appropriate time, that's what's going to make our organizations efficient and effective. The similarity between Luther Gulick and Frederick Taylor and Max Weber is that they were all focusing on organizational effectiveness and efficiency. And they were all searching for the one-size-fits-all approach that could apply in all organizations. The difference between those three classical theorists is Weber was looking at the organization structure, Taylor was looking at the organization's work processes, and Gulick was looking at the skills of leaders and managers in trying to make organizations efficient and effective. It's also important to note that the theories of Weber and Taylor especially come from the private sector, and that's especially true of Frederick Taylor. He devised scientific management for private sector organizations. And then the 1920s, a lot of public sector organizations started adopting the scientific management from private sector organizations. So it's developed in the world of business and then borrowed and applied to the world of public administration. So again, that's something to consider as you're thinking about public administration as an academic discipline. We said academic disciplines develop their own theories. Well, here in public administration, at least with the classical school, we borrow theories from the world of business, and we then modified them to try and make them fit our public organizations. But the classical school, again, is all focused on organizational effectiveness and efficiency. It's very much of a macro level focus on the organization and what is good for the organization. And it's also this focus on trying to find the one-size-fits-all approach, find the panacea that could be applied across all organizations to make all organizations effective and efficient. Then we have what we call our neoclassical schools of thought. So what happened in the development of organization theory? And again, Max Weber was late 1800s. Frederick Taylor was early 1900s, primarily the heyday in the 1920s. Luther Gulick in the principal school was primarily the 1930s into the 1940s. What happens is you go through your evolutionary development of organization theory. Each new school of thought is created as a rejoinder or a response to the weaknesses and flaws of that preceding school of thought. So all those neoclassical theories are theories that were developed to try and correct some of the flaws and the weaknesses with Weber, Taylor, Gulick, and the classical theorists. So some of the neoclassical schools of thought that developed through the evolution of organization theory are schools such as the human relations school, the human resource management school, the systems school, quality management school, organization culture school, and many others. But what I'd like to do is just kind of go through the neoclassical schools of thought through human relations, human resource management, systems, and some modern schools of thought, and show you how they have improved upon and changed the focus that we have just talked about under the classical school. So let's start with the human relations school of thought. So human relations theory is a neoclassical theory in that it is a theory that was developed to address some of the weaknesses associated with those classical theories that we just discussed. One of the major authors I'd like to talk about with human relations theory is Mary Parker Follett. Now, Mary Parker Follett, given when she was writing, a lot of public administration scholars will consider her to be a pre-human relations theorist because scientific management was going on in the 1920s. Mary Parker Follett was also writing in the 1920s. She was writing at the heyday of scientific management. She was writing when scientific management was being adopted by all of these organizations, both in the private as well as the public sector. But what she was doing in the 1920s is she was standing up and she was taking issue with the dehumanizing aspect of scientific management in a lot of these classical theories. She was concerned that scientific management, again, treated people like Boris beasts, it treated people like cogs in the machinery. And she really felt that to be efficient and effective as an organization, we needed to include those employees and give them avenues to participate in decision-making within the organization. Mary Parker Follett likened organizations to democracies. And she said, we need to study our organizations in a similar way as we study our system of democracy. She says, when you study a democracy, you come to the realization that there are two major flaws in a democratic system of government. One major flaw in a democracy is what she called the passivity of citizens. So citizens tend to take the path of least resistance in participating in a democracy. There are lots of ways you can participate in a democracy. One way in which you can participate in a democracy is you can run for office. That's a very time and resource intensive thing to do. A second way you can do it is to contribute money to a campaign or to a candidate. Again, that's kind of resource intensive. You could participate in city council meetings or school board meetings. Those are all resource intensive. Probably the least resource intensive way to participate is by voting, especially now. You can vote absentee, you can just fill out your ballot and mail it in. It's a very low resource way of participating. And so people usually participate in that way. They take a very passive role in their own self-governance in a democracy. And she said that's also true in an organization as well. I'm sorry, Rebecca had a question in text chat. How are these situated in the timeline of labor movements? That's an excellent question. Frederick Taylor, when Frederick Taylor was writing with scientific management, one of the reasons why scientific management became so popular is in a lot of our organizations at that time, we had a major gap between employees at the lower level of organizations and leaders at the upper level of organizations. We had very few middle managers within our organizations. And a lot of employees at the lower level of the organization felt exploited because they were being exploited by upper levels of the organization. Upton Sinclair and his Jungle that documents a lot of these abuses and exploitation of workers. And so I think it was in that context, as Rebecca says, that scientific management really starts to take hold because it created this level of middle managers to ensure that we were doing the jobs in the one best way to do those jobs. And I think that really kind of gave that backdrop for the development of a lot of these theories. And then when Mary Parker Follett comes along, Mary Parker Follett kind of fills in some of the gaps by saying we need to protect and empower employees even more than what we are currently doing. And I think that recognition of the exploitation of employees also kind of led Mary Parker Follett to take issue to a lot of the one best way to do the job type of approach from scientific management. And so you're right, this is a great example, Rebecca, of public administration being a function of its time, and that the theories that are developed are very much part of the time period in which they are being developed. They're very much time bound and need to be understood within the context of the time in which they were developed. So we have very passive citizens, and same way in organizations, we have very passive employees who don't really engage and allow their own self-governance. Then a second major flaw in a democratic system of government is what she refers to as particularized interests. And we're very familiar with this because this is basically James Madison and factions. Madison in Federalist number 10 told us about factions. He told us factions are a natural outgrowth of a democracy. You can't eliminate factions, because if you eliminate factions, you then eliminate democracy. So the best thing you do is try and control the effects, to try and control the conflict that is being created when these factions come into conflict with each other. As Mary Parker Follett says, democracies are based upon conflict. Whenever you allow people to have their own thoughts and express their own thoughts through freedom of speech, they are naturally going to come into conflict with other people who have different thoughts that they are expressing. So conflict is natural in a democracy. Conflict is also natural in an organization as well. So she says there are 3 ways we can deal with that conflict. One way to deal with conflict is domination. And this takes us all the way back to our discussion of John Gaventa and his 3 different faces of power. Remember, we talked about his 3 different faces of power. We said the first face of power was overt power. That's domination. One party wins, one party loses. One party dominates over the other party. She says that's the worst way to deal with conflict, because obviously the party that loses, the party that's being dominated, is going to be disaffected, going to have low levels of motivation, not going to be very happy with the result of that resolution of conflict. So that's what we want to try and avoid, is domination. The second way you can deal with conflict, she says, is through compromise. That's better than domination, but it's still not ideal. Because when you compromise, both parties in the debate give something up. So they're both going to be somewhat disappointed in that negotiated settlement, because they're both giving something up. The best way, she says, to deal with conflict is through integration. Integration is when you're able to get people together. People will then share their opinions and share their perspectives. As people share their perspectives, you then have this interpenetration of ideas, where people will be exposed to other ideas they had never thought of before. Ideas will interpenetrate across different groups of people, and you can then use all those different ideas to create a new third option that is acceptable to both parties. So we're creating something new by integrating all these different ideas and perspectives together. But Mary Parker Follett says the only way you can get to integration as a way to deal with conflict is through communication and participation. We need to provide avenues for participation for our employees in the organization so they can participate in their own governance. And that's how you deal with the conflict that naturally occurs within an organization. Now, through this participation, obviously, what she is saying is that you empower your employees. And so she makes this whole argument in her theory of power over versus power with. She says the classical school was predicated upon power over, where superiors, where leaders and managers would exercise power over their employees, and kind of, again, that first phase or second phase of power under Gaventa. She says instead of exercising power over, it should be a power with type of arrangement. She says power is not a resource to be given to someone else. Power is a resource to be developed. And so it's incumbent upon leaders and organizations to develop the resources and the power of their subordinates. And that will then empower those subordinates to be able to participate in their own governance. And that's how you create a functioning democratic organization. As you can see with Mary Parker Follett, it's a much warmer and fuzzier type of way of running an organization. And that's predicated upon empowering employees, allowing employees to participate in their own governance. That is a much different approach than certainly what we saw with the classical school. Now, Mary Parker Follett was writing again in the 1920s. She was writing at a time when, unfortunately, female theorists weren't really being listened to. And so a lot of the human relations theorists like Chester Barnard and Elton Mayo and Fritz Roethlisberger and others were unaware of Mary Parker Follett's theories and what Mary Parker Follett was writing. Now, 20, 30 years later, they started writing much of the same thing. that Mary Parker Fallen had written back in the 1920s. So she's very much of a pioneer, but a lot of people call her a pre-human relations theorist just because at the time, the human relations theorists didn't really know that they were parroting her theories because they hadn't read her theories because she was a woman writing in the 1920s. But she's very much of a pioneer in this field of organization theory and helps to transition us away from the classical school of dehumanizing employees into a recognition of the need to empower employees to participate in their own governance within organizations. And that's then how you make organizations effective and efficient. They're no longer bourgeois beasts, they're no longer cogs in the machinery, they're now vital parts of the daily decision-making of the organization. Chester Barnard, who is writing a little bit after Mary Parker Follett, is a human relations theorist. And Chester Barnard, just like Mary Parker Follett, took issue with some of the writings in the classical school. Chester Barnard argued that in order to be effective as an organization, leaders and managers needed to get compliance on the part of employees. So it wasn't a matter of just telling employees what to do. Here's the one best way to do the job, and you better do it in this one best way. Rather, it's getting their compliance. You have to induce them to comply with what you want them to do in order to be effective as an organization. And Barnard's approach was very much of a transactional type of relationship, where in this transactional relationship, leaders and managers would provide incentives to employees to induce those employees to provide contributions to the organization. So an incentive could be something like an extra day off or recognition as employee of the week or something like that, something that the employee places a value on. If the incentive is something that the employee will value, then the employee will then provide contributions to the organization to help the organization be effective in achieving its goals and objectives. Contributions are things such as effort and time and creativity. Those are the types of contributions you need to get from your employees. The important part of Barnard is twofold. The first important part of Barnard is that he's recognizing that organizations' leaders can only be successful if they have the compliance on the part of their employees. So it's not just telling them what to do, you have to incentivize and induce them to give you the contributions that you need as an organization. And the second important part of Chester Barnard is he made the argument that every employee is different. So they're not just replaceable cogs in machinery like in Frederick Taylor. Every employee is different. And every employee has their own, what he calls, zone of indifference. So if you ask someone to do something, if what you ask them to do violates their moral principles and violates their ethical standards, chances are they are going to be resistant in doing that. However, if you ask them to do something that does not violate their moral principles and their ethical standards, you're much more likely to get their cooperation and their compliance. Barnard argues that every employee has their own zone of indifference. That zone of indifference is where people are indifferent and they'll go ahead and do what you ask them to do because it's not violating their ethical principles. Each manager needs to know their employees and know each employee's zone of indifference and operate within that zone of indifference. Because once you cross over that zone of indifference and you start violating their ethical principles and their norms and their value system, that's when you will stop getting their compliance. So again, two important parts from Barnard. We have to get the compliance of our employees to be effective as an organization, and we must know our individual employees and know that they are different from each other, and every employee has a different zone of indifference. So with Barnard, you can see we're again moving away from the classical school. Now we're recognizing the importance of individual employees and how we can utilize those employees in order to make our organizations effective and efficient. Another human relations theorist is Elton Mayo. Now, if you've done psychology before undergrad, I'm sure you've talked about Elton Mayo. did a wide variety of different research projects, as any good social scientist would do. But Elton Mayo's most famous project was the Hawthorne experiments. And the Hawthorne experiments, what Mayo did is he went to the Hawthorne electrical plant and he wanted to test the relationship between physical stimuli and productivity levels. Because again, just like the other theorists, he's trying to make organizations more effective and more efficient. So what he decides is, let's look at the impact of a change in lighting level in the factory on efficiency and effectiveness, basically on productivity. So he generates a theory and he says, okay, if we turn the lighting level up, people will be able to see better, which will then make them more productive. So they turn the lighting level up, people become more productive. He checks off that hypothesis and says, hypothesis confirmed. Well, now let's turn the lighting level down. And the hypothesis, if you turn the lighting level way down, people will become less productive because they'll have a harder time seeing and a harder time doing their jobs. They turn the lighting level down, productivity continued to go up, and even higher than the original level where they had increased the lighting. So that disconfirms their hypothesis. And so the question is, well, why? Why did productivity go up even though we turned the lighting level down? It wasn't the physical stimulus of changing the lighting level that made productivity go up. Productivity was going up because people were being paid attention to. They knew they were part of an experiment. Researchers were asking them questions about how they felt, what they thought, what made them productive and what didn't make them productive. They were being paid attention to. So it really recognizes the social aspect of organizations, that people are social creatures, and we need to treat them as such and recognize that organizations are social environments. Frederick Taylor, Max Weber, Luther Gulick didn't really care very much about the social aspect of an organization. For them, for Weber, it was about structure. For Taylor, it was about the work process. For Gulick, it was about the principles of management. But here, Mayo is telling us the social aspect is also an important contributor to the effectiveness of the organization. Mayo also found that when he put people in groups, if one member of a group was not being productive, it made the rest of the group look bad. So the other members of the group would put pressure on that person to make them work harder so everyone in the group wouldn't look bad. So essentially what he finds out is that informal groups are important things to consider within organizations as well. So again, it really emphasizes this social aspect of organizations. If we neglect the social aspect, then our organizations are not going to be effective as they otherwise could be. Now, with the human relations theorists, we certainly have an improvement over classical theory. Now we are starting to take employees into consideration. We're taking their relationships into consideration. We're taking into consideration the social environment within an organization. That is certainly an improvement over the classical school of thought. However, the reason why we were doing that, the reason why we were trying to get the compliance of our employees is under Chester Barnard, or recognizing the importance of groups and social interactions in Elton Mayo's theories, is we were doing all that for a purpose. And the purpose was, again, to make our organizations effective and efficient. So the focus was on the welfare of the organization. It was seen by some authors as being very exploitative, that you were exploiting workers and exploiting their social needs in order to make the organization effective without a lot of regard for the development of that individual employee. And because of those criticisms of human relations theory, that it exploited individual employees for the benefit of the organization and the achievement of organization goals, we then saw another neoclassical school of thought created, known as the Human Resource Management School. In the Human Resource Management School, we are now not only asking the question, what can we get from employees to benefit the organization, but we now start to ask the question, how can the organization help benefit employees? And how can the organization help employees develop their own resources. Hence the reason why it's called the Human Resource Management School. So 3 authors in the Human Resource Management School are Abraham Maslow, Douglas McGregor, and Chris Argyris. In Abraham Maslow, he presents to us this idea of the hierarchy of needs. And again, if you took psychology undergrad, you probably talked a lot about Abraham Maslow and his hierarchy of needs. In the hierarchy of needs, like you see the little diagram on the screen, it's this pyramidal triangular shape whereby you have different levels of needs. You have physiological needs. So physiological needs are things such as clothing and shelter and food. Those are your physiological needs. Then you also have safety needs, the feeling of being safe from harm. There are belonging needs, which are the feeling of needing to belong to something more than yourself, to belong in a group of people. Those are kind of your social types of needs. There's a level of needs called esteem needs, that you need to be held in as high esteem by your peers and by your colleagues, a need to be respected by others. And at the top level, you have what are called your self-actualization needs. Self-actualization is basically becoming all that you've become, being all that you can be, achieving your highest level of development. So what Maslow tells us is that your bottom needs in that triangle are your deficiency needs or your deficit needs, and that people are motivated by a deficiency in one of those needs. So if you don't have enough food, you are motivated to try and acquire enough food. If you don't feel safe, you're motivated to try and enhance your safety, and so on and so on. So you're being motivated by deficiencies in those needs. The top level need of self-actualization is what's referred to as a being or a growth need, in that you are not being motivated by a deficiency in self-actualization, but rather you're being motivated by the desire for growth, meaning that self-actualization is never really satisfying. You're always growing, you're always working towards self-actualization, and it's the desire to grow that is motivating you. For the deficit needs, once you have met that deficiency, then that need no longer motivates you. So once you have acquired all the food that you need, then you're no longer motivated by food, and that ceases to be a motivator. But with the growth need, like self-actualization, you are always motivated by the desire to grow and to self-actualize. Well, and again, that's kind of the classical approach to Abraham Maslow and his hierarchy of needs. Later in his life, Abraham Maslow kind of changed up his hierarchy of needs, and instead of self-actualization, that highest need was giving back to those other than yourself and giving back to the community. And so again, it's kind of this higher order type of need. The importance of Abraham Maslow is that he argues that these needs are not in the same order for every person, that the order of the hierarchy needs can change depending upon individual, which again means that we have to know our individual employees, we have to know what our employees need, and then work toward helping them achieve those needs and to fill those deficiencies, and then eventually helping them along their path toward growing, toward being all that they can be. Douglas McGregor, who is a big believer in Abraham Maslow and his hierarchy of needs, took Maslow's theory and used it to create 2 theories of his own, Theory X and Theory Y. He says basically with Theory X assumes that employees are lazy, that they are not very intelligent, that they are not very creative or innovative, that they don't want to work. It's a very negative view of employees. And that's what he called Theory X. Theory Y is the complete opposite of Theory X. So whereas Theory X said people are lazy, Theory Y says people are ambitious. Where Theory X says people are not intelligent, Theory Y says people are intelligent. Where Theory X says people are not creative, Theory Y says people are very creative. And so it's the complete opposite of Theory X. McGregor says that the majority of employees are Theory Y employees. The majority of employees are creative, they are ambitious, they do put forth work, and working is just as natural as play under a Theory Y type of mentality. And the majority of our employees are Theory Y. The problem is, while the majority of our employees are theory Y, the majority of our organizations are theory X. So we are essentially shoehorning theory Y employees into classical theory X organizations. Most of our organizations are still very much like a Weberian ideal bureaucracy. They're very theory X in nature, but most of our employees are theory Y. McGregor says that's a major problem because a theory X organization is going to really hurt the motivational levels of our theory Y employees. So make our theory Y employees kind of hopeless. They don't really see a future in the organization. The organization will not be effective. And these individuals will not be able to self-actualize. The organization will stand in the way of their growth towards self-actualization. Chris Ardress, who is a student of Douglas McGregor, took McGregor's theories and expounded upon them. And Ardress argued that, yes, most employees are theory Y, and they become more theory Y as they go through a maturation process. As people age and develop, according to Chris Ardress, they go through a personal growth arc of development. And as they mature, they go through personal growth, where they become more interested in a longer term as opposed to a shorter term perspective. They're no longer just interested in a promotion for tomorrow. They're interested in the remainder of their career and the trajectory of their career and their future retirement. So their perspective becomes much longer in term. They become more cognizant of their role in the community and giving back to the community and giving back to their profession. They aspire to superordinate positions, that as people go through their personal growth arc, they aspire to higher level positions, seeking out more authority, seeking out more responsibility than they had when they were younger. And what Ardress says is, again, they're theory Y, but they become more theory Y as they go through this maturation process. So therefore, it's incumbent upon the organization to help these employees through their personal growth process, to help them move closer and closer to self-actualization. So what both Chris Ardress and Douglas McGregor say in human resource management theory is that the organizations need to be changed in order to match the needs of theory Y employees. It's essentially, again, to take a line from John F. Kennedy, when he said, ask what you can do for your country, not what your country can do for you. Well, here, ask not what you can do for your organization, but ask what the organization can do for you. How can the organization help you develop as a human resource? So as you can see, what human resource management theory does is it corrects the problem of the dehumanization that we had under the classical school of organization theory. It also corrects the exploitation problem that we had in human relations theory, because now it's a job of the organization to help their employees develop as human resources, even if that development means that these employees are going to take their skills and go elsewhere. It's true that they may leave the organization once they've developed these skills. Under human resource management theory, that's okay, because you have helped them develop as human resources. That's part of the job, is to help them develop as human resources, even if they take their skills to another organization. But you see, again, it's a much kinder and gentler approach, valuing employees as human resources, that the organization has an obligation to these employees to help them develop their skills and their resources. Human resource management theorists like Douglas McGregor and Chris Ardress, now we're going through the 50s and the 60s and into the 1970s, and Ardress actually was writing into the 80s and 90s as well. That's a neoclassical school of thought known as human resource management theory. Another neoclassical school that really started to grow in the 1960s and 70s and 80s was the school known as systems theory. So up to this point, when we're talking about classical school or neoclassical schools such as human relations and human resource management, we were focusing primarily inside the organization. And most of the way we were studying public organizations was to study them internally. People within the organizations, how leaders and subordinates interact with each other, their relationships within the organization, the work that's being done within the organization. But in system school of thought, we start to look beyond the walls of the organization. And there are two different parts of systems theory. There's closed or natural systems theory versus open systems theory. In closed or natural systems theory, natural systems theorists will look at public organizations as being living organisms. And so we can analyze an organization the way we would analyze a living organism. And if you remember way back, I think in our first or second class session, we talked about the ecology of public administration and John Gauss. This is kind of this ecology of public administration. So you can understand how an organization grows in the same way that you will understand perhaps how a plant grows. So you can understand the growth of a plant, the development of a plant, based upon the amount of sunshine it gets, based upon the amount of fertilizer it gets, the amount of water it gets, where it's located in the room. All those things will contribute to or detract from the growth of that plant. Well, it's a similar type of thing with an organization, in that you can understand that organization as being kind of that living organism that's being affected by its external environment. The idea here is that if an organization is like a living organism, then that organization, from the moment that it is created, again, not to depress you too much, but from the moment it's created, it begins its decaying process and it starts dissipating energy out into its environment. The dissipation of energy from an organism into its environment is referred to as the entropy process. Natural systems theorists argue that all organizations, from the time they're created, will go through this entropy process. The goal of organizations is to find a balance between the organization and the environment that will allow them to slow down this entropy process. Because the more you slow down the entropy process, the longer the organization is likely to survive. And the ultimate goal of an organization is survival. Just like with a living organism, an organization's ultimate goal is to survive. So if you want to study an organization, we study it like we would study maybe the human body. So the human body is considered to be in a steady state, a point of what's called homeostasis. And that steady state is homeostasis. Homeostasis is I misspelled that, but homeostasis is a balance where the human body has, regular blood pressure, normal blood pressure, is devoid of illness and disease, so on and so on. That's the steady state. That's a point of homeostasis. And the longer you can be in that state of homeostasis, that state of balance, the longer you can survive as a human being. Same type of thing with organizations. And so natural systems theorists are looking in the organization in terms of all the systems within the organization, and that all these systems are in balance and the organization's in harmony with its external environment. But a lot of the focus in natural systems theory is again on what's going on inside that organization to find that point of homeostasis, that balance within the organization. The second approach of systems theory is open systems theory. In open systems theory, you look much more at the external environment. And one of the ideas under open systems theory is that there's something called negative entropy. So natural systems theorists said that all organizations go through this entropy process. They dissipate energy into the environment. Once they've lost too much energy, then they go out of existence because they no longer have the resources to support their survival. Open systems theorists say, yes, organizations dissipate energy and resources into their environment, but there's a negative entropy process whereby they can also import new energies from the environment into the organization. So they can bring in resources such as new employees. They can bring in resources such as new money. They can bring in resources such as political support and citizen support. And all those resources that they're importing into the organization from the external environment will then help the organization survive. And so organizations under open systems theories don't necessarily go out of existence. It's a more dynamic type of relationship whereby if they're doing a good job at negative entropy and pulling these new resources in from the environment, that's going to lengthen their survival, and that's going to keep them around a lot longer. But the importance of systems theory, though, is again, you're looking at what's going on in the organization in relationship to what's going on out in the external environment. And that's the big addition that we get from systems theory is we now look at those relationships between the organization and its external environment. And this is where we also underscore that big difference between public organizations and private organizations, in that the external environment for public organizations is a politically driven environment. The external environment for a private organization is a market-driven environment. And so a market-driven environment is going to have different actors than a politically driven environment. The market-driven environment is going to have different behaviors than the politically driven environment. And so it kind of, again, recommends to us that we need to have a special way, a different way of studying public administration, public organizations, because their environment is much more political than market-based as it would be over in the private sector. So that's systems theory, systems school of thought. Again, systems school of thought, 60s, 70s, 80s, and still going on today. That addition of looking at the external environment and the relationship between the organization and its external environment. Then as you fast forward more into modern day, we're talking about 1990s and into the 2000s and 2010s, there are a lot of modern theories that have grown up over the past few decades. The one that we're going to focus on in this class that I think is important to focus on for our discussion of public administration as a discipline or field of study is the school of organization culture. And this is one of my favorite schools of thought in organization theory. Organization culture argues that every organization has its own unique culture. And I think we all kind of have a general sense of what a culture is. Culture is a shared system of values and norms and expectations for behavior. And so if you're in a culture, that culture has these shared types of expectations. We have political cultures on a societal level, but we also then have cultures within our organizations, these shared values and these shared expectations. Organizations can be studied in terms of their culture. And so just like you would want to study an ancient culture and you'd be an archaeologist, you'll go out there in an archaeological dig and you will dig up artifacts like bowls, eating utensils, and things such as that. Those artifacts are tangible things that you will dig up that will then give you insight into how that ancient society, that ancient culture lived and what that ancient culture valued. You can do the same thing in an organization, in that organizations also create their own artifacts. And so if you want to go on an archaeological dig of an organization, some of the artifacts that you're going to dig up are things such as agendas for meetings, minutes from previous meetings, policy and procedure manuals. Those are all tangible artifacts that can give us insight into the culture of the organization. Whenever I do site visits of MPA programs, one of the things that we actually look at is we look at agendas for meetings and we look at minutes from meetings of the previous year for faculty meetings to see who's participating, to see if the people who are participating are nucleus faculty, if those nucleus faculty are having a determining influence on the decisions of the program, because we want to see what the culture of that program really is. So artifacts are at a very visible, tangible level. We can see those. Those are produced by organizations. They're very easy to dig up. They're very easy to analyze. But there's a second level of culture that we can analyze as well. And we analyze things such as the espoused values of that organization. So what are the values of the organization, and what does the organization tell us about those values? So we look at things like the organization's mission statement, the organization's vision statement, the goals and objectives of the organization in that organization's strategic plan. Those are the values of the organization that it is telling us about. Those are its espoused values. And again, those are pretty easy to see. They may not be as numerous as the artifacts, but they're relatively easy for us to study. But there is a third, more hidden level of organization culture known as basic assumptions. Every organization will have a set of basic assumptions that all employees hold, but they don't talk a whole lot about. So these are assumptions about how you're supposed to behave, how you're supposed to interact and relate with other people in the organization, how you're supposed to treat and behave and interact with people outside the organization. Those are all your basic assumptions. Since they are not spoken and they're just assumed that everyone knows what those basic values are, they're much more difficult for us to measure as students of public organization theory. What we have to do is we have to look at behaviors of individuals and then kind of deduce from those behaviors of those individuals what their basic assumptions are. So it's a much more difficult way of studying organization culture, but it's still a very important part of the culture of an organization. Leaders can embed cultures into organizations. And so when a new leader comes into an organization, they can spend their political capital embedding the culture into that organization. A culture is a difficult thing to change. Changing a culture will not only take resources and support, it will take time. It's very gradual to be able to change an organization culture. But the School of Organization Culture is an important one because, again, it underscores the complexity of studying public administration. If we assume that every organization has its own unique culture, then that means there are different ways of studying each individual organization. And the theories and the models that work for one organization culture may not work for another organization culture. And so that's why I always say my favorite answer to every question in public administration is it depends. It depends upon the culture of the organization. It depends upon the time in which we are studying that organization. It depends upon the individuals who are involved in that organization. It depends upon the environment that surrounds that organization. It really does depend upon the individual organization. So the thread that then kind of ties this entire discussion of the development of organization theory together is that as organization theory has developed through all these different schools of thought, that development has been marked by a movement away from the one-size-fits-all approach toward a more contextual, contingency-based approach, where it really does depend upon the setting and the situation that we are dealing with. What that means is, as we've moved away from the one-size-fits-all approach to a much more nuanced, contextual approach, we have become much more complex and much more sophisticated in the way in which we study public organizations and public administration. And you can see that if you go and find any public administration journal, go look at Public Administration Review, which is the granddaddy of them all in terms of public administration journals. Get a copy of an article from the 1960s in Public Administration Review and compare it to an article from the most recent edition of Public Administration Review. And what you're going to see is that the methodologies and the theories are far more sophisticated and complex today than they were back in the 1960s. And I think that's kind of the moral of the story for how we study public administration, is it's a much more complex, much more sophisticated approach than it ever has been in the past. Now, it's true that as we are studying public administration, a lot of these theories and a lot of these models we have borrowed from other disciplines. Frederick Taylor is borrowed from the private sector. Elton Mayo and Abraham Maslow are borrowed from the world of psychology. Some parts of organization culture are borrowed from the world of anthropology and archaeology. Even some theories like field theory, which you'll talk about in future courses, field theory is borrowed from the world of physics and from quantum physics. And so we borrow liberally from a lot of other academic disciplines, and then we manipulate or we change those theories, we adapt those theories to help them fit the unique characteristics of how we carry out our functions in the public sector. And so as you're thinking about whether or not public administration is an academic discipline, think about these theories and these schools of thought that we have discussed over the past hour or so, and think about where those theories came from, how those theories are unique or different when they are applied to public organizations. There is no right or wrong answer about whether or not public administration is an academic discipline. But think about where the theories come from, how the theories are unique in public administration, and that should then guide you in deciding whether or not you think public administration is an academic discipline. But I think it's an important thing to consider and for you to think about in this class as you enter the MPA program, because there needs to be a justification for why you are getting an MPA degree as opposed to an MBA degree. And so when people then ask you why the MPA instead of the MBA, you can really have an answer to give them as to why you're getting the MPA and why studying public organizations is unique and different than studying private corporations. But again, this is kind of really quick overview of the organization theory literature and the different schools of thought in organization theory. You'll just give you a little taste of it. Once you get to PPA 660, you're really going to get into a lot of these theories a lot more in depth. You'll reread some of the articles like the Max Weber article, the Mary Parker Follett article, and then you'll also talk about some additional theorists as well in each one of those different schools of thought. But I just kind of want to give you kind of a flavor of the chronological development evolution of how we study public administration and how we study public organizations. So at this point, are there any preliminary questions on these schools of thought or these organization theories? So when you're working on that scenario on your midterm assessment, again, one question you'll be citing for me, two classical theories. The other question you'll be talking about two neoclassical theories. Classical theories are Weber, Taylor, Gulick. Neoclassical theories are anything from human relations, human resource management, systems theory, organization culture. We consider all those to be those neoclassical types of theories. So at this point, you now have all the information that you need in order to do all 5 scenarios on the midterm assessment. Let's see, Rebecca, curious how these theories might apply to things like the Great Resignation and quiet quitting. It's been really interesting in the public sector that, the pandemic has really changed a lot of things, obviously. But for years in the public sector, we have been talking about the bubble of retirements, and that we have a lot of baby boomers who are ready to retire. And for years, we've been expecting for that bubble to burst and that we're going to lose a lot of people. But every year we keep saying that bubble's going to burst, and that bubble never really did burst. Now we're getting a loss of employees, not because of aging and not because of retirement, but because of, as you said, things like the Great Resignation. And after the COVID-19 pandemic, people who are starting to think it's not really worth it for me to stay in this organization, or it's not worth it for me to go to the office 5 days a week from 9 to 5. And there are other things I can do remotely and working from home. And so you're starting to lose employees for reasons other than retirement. When you have that type of a retention issue for reasons other than retirement, it really does put a spotlight on some of these human resource management types of theories. It really does put a spotlight on how organizations are treating their employees. What types of things do employees value that organizations can then provide as incentives to keep these employees from quiet quitting or to keep these employees from resigning from their positions. Again, in order to determine what types of incentives would keep people in organizations, it's going to be very much on an individual basis. And there's a really interesting theory in public administration, which is called Vroom's expectancy theory. And it literally, the person's name is Vroom, just like kind of a car, Vroom. Vroom's expectancy theory. And basically what Vroom's expectancy theory says is that people, when they decide whether or not to stay in their position or whether or not to put forth effort to get a job done, they kind of do an informal calculation where they will ask themselves, what is the likelihood that if I put forth this effort, it will result in a certain level of productivity? So if I decide, yes, I'm going to come into the office and yes, I'm going to put the effort forth, what's the likelihood that if I put forth that effort, that I will finish up this report and get this report done on time? So what's the probability that a level of effort will lead to a certain level of productivity? Then they will consider what's the likelihood that if I achieve this level of productivity, that there will be an outcome that I will get from it. And so if I get this report done on time, I put in the effort to get this report done on time, what's the probability that if I get this report done on time, I will then get this incentive such as, I'll be employee of the week or something like that. That's the outcome that I'm expecting if I achieve this level of performance. But what's the likelihood that that outcome will actually occur? And then how much of a value do I place on that outcome of being employee of the week? That's what's called the valence level. And so these are calculations that informally employees will make, that if they don't think there's a high likelihood that staying in their position will accomplish what they want to accomplish, then chances are they're not going to stay in that position. Or if they feel that if they do stay in this position, they're not going to get the type of reward that they thought they would get, or if they think they're going to get a reward that they don't place a very high valence or valuation on, then chances are they're not going to stay in that position. And everyone's going to have a different calculation under Vroom's expectancy theory formula. And so I think what it means for Rebecca's question, which is a great question, I think it means that employers and organizations need to really heed the human resource management theories, that you need to know your employees, you need to know what they value, you need to know how confident they are in their abilities, and then you need to use that information in order to help them achieve their goals and develop as resources, or else you're going to see them resigning, you're going to see them quiet quitting, and the problem is just going to get a whole lot worse. I think that today in this environment, we really need much more human resource management type of approach than certainly a classical approach that you may have been able to get away with back in the 1950s and the 1960s. Again, the theories that we use really are very much an artifact of the time. And here in the post-pandemic world of public employment, it's really important that we make sure that as organizations, we are helping these people develop as human resources, or else we're going to continue to have those problems with employee retention. But I think that's a great question and a great point, Rebecca. Hope that answers the question. But yeah, it really does depend upon the individual employee. Which, again, it's much more sophisticated, much more complicated to study public administration today than it was when Woodrow Wilson was writing his article back in 1887, which is another thing to then consider when you're thinking about public administration as an academic discipline. Typically, the more complex something is, the more theories and nuanced models are needed to study it. The more unique theories and models you need to study phenomena, the more likely that you will need to be a standalone academic discipline as opposed to a subfield in another existing academic discipline. So, very good question. Any other questions or clarifications or observations on any of this material? Okay. As you are working through the midterm assessment, again, if you have any questions at all on it or how to apply this material, feel free to send me an email and I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have. Remember, by midnight next Tuesday, you have Beachboard essay number 3, and you then also have the midterm assessment that is due. Okay. All right, well, thank you very much for being here tonight. I hope this information was useful for you, and I'll have this recording up on our Beachboard site no later than tomorrow morning for you to review. Otherwise, I hope everyone has a good remainder of the week, and I will talk to you again next Wednesday afternoon. Thanks, everyone. Take care.